There are stories we carry with us like old hymns, quiet, haunting, and full of something deeper than words. Some stories don't ask to be told. They linger in silence, like incense after the Mass has ended, and only those who stay behind long enough can still smell it in the air. What I'm about to share with you is not something I plan to speak aloud. For a long time, I kept it tucked away in the corners of memory, unsure of how to name it, afraid, perhaps, that putting it into words might somehow cheapen it, or worse, invite doubt. But there are moments in life that are too sacred not to share. It happened in a place few people know about, a quiet hilltop parish in southern Germany. A church with no internet, no fancy sound systems, no social media presence, just old stone walls, flickering candles, and the echo of hymns that hadn't changed in generations. I had been there for 5 years, assigned to shepherd a small community of farmers, widows, school children, and people who still left apples and bread outside their neighbors' doors in winter. It wasn't a busy parish. We rarely had visitors, unless it was for a funeral or wedding. But the faith in that little village, it ran deep, like the roots of the chestnut trees surrounding the cemetery. I'd celebrated countless masses in that church, watched snow fall through stained glass windows, baptized babies wrapped in quilts, and knelt with grieving families in pews worn smooth by time. And yet, nothing in all those years prepared me for what happened on that Good Friday. Because on that day, just as we prepared to close the liturgy in silence, when the sanctuary was dim, and the cross lay bare, and all hearts were turned toward the mystery of suffering, something happened. Something small, something sacred, something no camera could catch, no article could fully explain. For just a few moments, the consecrated host began to glow. Not with the harsh brilliance of spotlights or the unnatural shimmer of trickery, but with a soft, golden light, like the last sliver of sunset resting on a chalice. It didn't blind us, it didn't speak, it simply was. And in those few minutes, every sound seemed to vanish. Even the wind outside the stained glass windows held its breath. Children stopped fidgeting. Old men forgot their aching knees. Time itself seemed to hush. Some say it was the way the light hit the altar. Others whispered of miracles. I don't pretend to understand, but I do know this. In that moment, I didn't feel awe or fear. I felt presence and peace. The kind of peace you don't try to analyze, only receive. Since that day, I've often wondered whether we were given a glimpse, just a glimpse, of what it means when we say, "This is my body," not just words, not just memory, but real, living, burning, softly, with the light of the one who promised he'd never leave us. You might ask why I'm sharing this now, after all these years. The answer is simple: because faith, like light, is meant to be passed on. And because someone, somewhere, might need this reminder today, that even in silence, even in doubt, even in the quiet corners of forgotten places, God is still with us. He comes quietly, always has. Now, if you're still with me, take a breath. Let's step together into this story, not as a mystery to solve, but as a gift to sit with. A sacred whisper from a village chapel where heaven touched earth for a heartbeat and then was gone. Welcome to the host that glowed. Chapter 1. The Parish on the Hill. They say some hills remember, not in the way a person does, with names and dates, but in the quiet holding of footsteps long vanished, of seasons that return each year like old hymns repeating themselves. Our hill, street, Otmar's Hill, was like that. It wasn't the highest hill in the region, nor the most scenic, but for those of us who called it home, it was sacred, rooted, a place that seemed to breathe with memory. From my cottage window, I could see the church spire rising through the fog like a finger pointing heavenward. The building itself wasn't grand, built of worn stones and timber centuries ago. It leaned slightly to one side, as if bowing before something no one else could see. The bell tower had only one functioning bell, and it rang slowly, solemnly, with a sound that wrapped around the village like a prayer whispered into morning frost. This was St. Otmar's parish, my parish, and for the past 5 years, I had served as its priest. My name is Elias, Father Elias, if you prefer formality, but the people here had long since dropped the title and simply called me Padre, or sometimes, with affection, Old Crow. I was 62 when I arrived, and 67 now, though some mornings I felt a good decade older. My joints reminded me of the passing time more than the church calendar did. But age never mattered here. What mattered was presence, showing up, being here when people needed you. And during Lent, especially during Lent, the need ran deeper than usual. That year, the snow lingered longer than we expected. By Macha's end, most villages below had seen the first shy signs of spring, crocuses nudging through thawing soil, blackbirds returning to their favorite eaves. But not us. Our hill still wore a coat of white, and the trees stood bare like monks in silent penance. It gave everything a stark kind of beauty, solemn, unadorned, almost liturgical. I would wake early each morning, make tea from dried mint, and watch the sky change. Pale blue to amber, amber to gray. The sun never quite made it through the clouds. And yet, something in that filtered light felt holy, like being inside a cathedral whose windows had all been frosted by God's own breath. Our parishioners were few, but faithful. There was Frau Lind, whose husband died during the last blizzard of '92, and who still brought fresh wildflowers to the altar every Saturday, even if she had to dig through snow to find them. There were the Baumgartners, with 5 children and another on the way, who never missed a Sunday and always sang off key with all their hearts. And old Herr Thomas, who sat in the back pew, eyes closed, whispering prayers for people he no longer remembered. These were not people who needed signs and wonders to believe. Their faith was stitched into their days like the buttons on their winter coats. Simple, strong, and unshakable, Holy Week was approaching, and with it, our preparations, not elaborate ones. Street Otmar's had neither budget nor ambition for spectacle, but what we lacked in gold or incense, we made up for in devotion. Each evening, the small choir gathered in the back of the nave to rehearse. Their voices rose like a flock of sparrows, a little incoordinated, but sincere. They practiced the Stabat Mater with trembling reverence, often stopping to giggle when someone hit the wrong note, then quickly apologizing as if they'd offended the saints themselves. The children painted wooden crosses with tempera and set them along the aisle. Sister Annalise, our resident nun, stitched purple cloths to veil the statues. And I walked the perimeter of the sanctuary each morning, whispering psalms under my breath, asking the Lord to bless the humble work of our hands. There was something about Holy Week that always brought a hush to the hill. It wasn't just the fasts or the silence or the stripping away of alleluias. It was something deeper, like the land itself remembered, as if the stones of the church had absorbed the weeping of centuries, and now mourned alongside us. I often wondered what it must have been like for those first Christians. To walk with Jesus into Jerusalem, to watch him cleanse the temple, to see his face darken with sorrow during the Last Supper, here, in our little village so far removed from ancient Israel. We did our best to enter into the mystery, through liturgy, through fasting, through an aching kind of stillness. And somehow, each year, that stillness deepened. This particular Lent, though, I felt something different. Not fear, not unease, something like anticipation. It was in the air, like ozone before a storm. It made my fingers tingle as I touched the altar cloth, made the flame of the sanctuary lamp seem brighter, even though it was the same candle as always. I didn't speak of it to anyone. What would I say? The walls are humming, and I think heaven is watching us more closely than usual. Instead, I waited, I listened, and the hill waited with me. The night before Palm Sunday, the temperature dropped again. A frost came, delicate and glittering, turning even dead branches into silver filigree. I walked through the cemetery with a lantern in hand, checking that no stones had been disturbed by the last freeze. Snow crunched underfoot like broken glass. At the far end of the yard, beneath an old yew tree, lay the grave of Father Joseph, the priest who had served here for 40 years before me. I paused there, as I often did, offering a silent prayer for his soul. The wind rustled the branches above, and for a moment, I thought I heard a voice. But no, just the groaning of old wood. Still, I lingered. Guide me, old friend, I whispered. Help me prepare them. Something is coming. I didn't know what I meant. I only knew the feeling hadn't left me. Something was indeed coming, and the hill already knew. Chapter 2. The Silence of Good Friday. The sky that Friday held its breath. I've always felt that Good Friday carries a particular stillness, one that seems to settle not just over the church but over the land itself. The kind of hush that makes birds pause in flight, that makes winds lose their appetite for motion. That year, the silence was even deeper. By noon, the village had already quieted. The shops were closed, the streets were empty, no deliveries, no passing cars. Even the dogs, usually barking at squirrels or distant footsteps, curled under porches as if they, too, understood. At St. Otmar's, the pews began to fill slowly. People arrived not in conversation but in silence. Their boots made soft impressions in the lingering frost, and they brushed the snow from their coats with reverence more than habit. Inside, the church was dim. The light filtered through the thick clouds outside and the violet-stained windows within. The altar was bare, the crucifix covered, the tabernacle open and empty. I stood at the back of the sacristy, vesting in silence, There is something sobering about the black vestments of Good Friday. No shimmer, no embroidery, just simple, deep cloth, like the shadows of the tomb. As I slipped them over my shoulders, I felt the weight of them, not physically, but spiritually. They reminded me I wasn't simply performing a ritual. I was entering a mystery, a sacred remembering. At exactly 3 o'clock, the hour of his death, I stepped into the sanctuary. All stood. The opening rites of Good Friday are unlike any other. There is no singing, no jubilant entrance hymn. Instead, I prostrated myself before the altar, face down on the cold stone floor, arms outstretched. I let the silence of centuries settle over me. Behind me, the people knelt. It was not a silence of absence. It was a silence of presence. When I rose, I moved to the lectern and began the solemn readings, the prophecy from Isaiah, the letter to the Hebrews. My voice felt smaller than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. Then came the Passion according to St. John. 3 voices, mine, the deacons, and the readers. We spoke the ancient words like those who had lived them. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" And the story unfolded again. The betrayal, the trial, the scourging, the crown of thorns, the cross. By the time we reached Golgotha, some were weeping, others sat stiffly, as though afraid that any movement might break the sacred spell. Children fidgeted less than usual. Even the infants were quiet, lulled not by sleep, but by the weight of the moment. We venerated the cross in procession, each person coming forward to touch, kiss, or kneel before the wooden beams. I had placed the crucifix in the center of the aisle, resting on crimson cloth. One by one, the faithful came, even those who hadn't stepped inside a church in months. And then came the time for Holy Communion. Because there is no consecration on Good Friday, the hosts are taken from the reserve, previously consecrated on Holy Thursday. I returned to the sacristy and opened the small wooden tabernacle where they had been reverently placed. Holding the ciborium close to my chest, I walked back toward the altar, and that was when it happened. It began subtly, so subtly I thought it might be my eyes adjusting to the gloom. But then I saw it more clearly. A faint light, soft, pale, golden. It wasn't coming from the candles. They were unlit. It wasn't a trick of the stained glass. It was coming from the hosts themselves. Not all of them, just one, the one at the top of the ciborium. It glowed, not brightly, not as a flame, but as if it were alive with some inner radiance, like the moon caught behind clouds. Gentle, unassuming, but unmistakable. I stopped walking. A few heads turned. Perhaps they noticed my hesitation. I looked down again. Still there. The glow didn't pulse. It didn't flicker. It just was. I glanced at the crucifix, still veiled, and then I felt it. A presence. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't the usual comfort I feel during adoration, nor the quiet intimacy of private prayer. It was something deeper, sharper, as though time itself had paused, and the veil between worlds had thinned. The church was utterly silent. Not even a cough, not a shuffle, no creaking of pews. Everyone was holding their breath. I stepped slowly to the altar, heart pounding, and placed the ciborium down as gently as one lays a newborn. I wanted to say something, to acknowledge what I was seeing, but no words came, so I bowed low. I knelt, eyes fixed on that single glowing host. A moment passed, then another, and then the light began to fade. Not suddenly, not like a switch flipped off, but gradually, like morning fog retreating from a field. The glow softened, dimmed, and finally disappeared. I exhaled. Only then did I realize I had been holding my breath. Behind me, someone wept. Another whispered, "Did you see?" But the moment had passed. I rose, offered the simple prayer before communion, and distributed the hosts. My hands trembled as I held them, as I placed them gently onto the tongues and into the palms of my parishioners. I noticed some eyes brimming with tears. Others stared, unblinking, as though trying to memorize the shape of the sacred. After communion, we returned the ciborium to the tabernacle. The door closed with a soft click, and the sanctuary lamp flickered to life beside it. The rest of the liturgy unfolded as usual. The concluding prayers, the silent departure, no final hymn, no dismissal. The people left slowly, as though stepping out of another world. I remained, kneeling in the front pew. I didn't need to ask anyone if they'd seen it. I knew, and I knew we would never be the same again. Chapter 3. The light no one expected. I have often wondered how miracles choose their moments. Not with thunder, not with trumpet blasts or grand declarations, but with stillness, deep, solemn stillness. That is how it happened. The day after Good Friday, the village was quieter than usual. Holy Saturday has always carried an air of suspension, like a held breath between death and resurrection. In our small parish, we observed it with a kind of sacred restraint. No bells, no music, just waiting. But what happened during the liturgy the day before, the light from the host, had left something behind. A residue, almost, like the scent of incense that clings to your clothes even after you've left the chapel. The air still felt charged. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't fear, it was something closer to awe. My mind replayed the moment over and over, the soft glow, the silence, the sense that heaven had cracked open, just slightly, to peer through, and in the middle of it all, that host, so still, so alive. I didn't speak of it to anyone. I wasn't sure if I should. Perhaps I imagined it, perhaps it had been the play of light through glass. But deep down, I knew better, and I wasn't the only one. Sunday morning came, and with it, the joy of Easter. Our little church filled with the scent of lilies and beeswax. White cloths replaced the violet. The statues were unveiled. Bells rang for the first time in 3 days. And people smiled again. But underneath the celebration was a current of quiet wonder. Parishioners would glance toward the altar, toward the tabernacle, then quickly look away, as if afraid they'd see something, or afraid they wouldn't. After Mass, as I stood near the doors greeting people, Frau Lind approached me. "Padre," she said gently, "did you see it, too?" I met her eyes. There was no need to ask what she meant. I did. She nodded slowly. It wasn't just me. Then, that was the beginning. One by one, others came, in whispers, in glances, in hesitant sentences trailing off mid-thought. None of them used the word miracle. No one dared, but all of them had seen something. Not everyone, of course. Some had their eyes closed in prayer. Others may have been too far to notice. But enough had seen, enough to know it wasn't illusion. They all described it the same way, a soft white glow. Like moonlight on water, gentle, but clear. It didn't burn, it didn't flicker, it simply was. No one had moved, no one had reached for their phones. It wasn't something you film, said Herr Thomas, the old widower who barely spoke. It was something you witness. The next day, I sat alone in the nave, the light from the tall windows casting faint gold across the wooden pews. I thought of how the world demands proof, videos, documentation, replication, and yet, the truest things often leave no record. When the risen Christ appeared to Mary Magdalene, there were no scribes, no cameras, just tears and the sound of her name. So perhaps it made sense that no one had moved, that not a single parishioner had reached into their coat for a device. The moment had held them still, and perhaps that was the point. I walked slowly to the sanctuary, genuflected, and sat before the tabernacle. The sanctuary lamp flickered beside me. Warm and constant, I whispered a prayer I hadn't said in years. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And then I waited. Nothing happened, not in the dramatic sense. But the silence felt alive. In the days that followed, the village changed, though subtly. People lingered longer after Mass. They knelt longer. There was more stillness in their presence, more reverence. Even the children seemed to sense it. One evening, as I prepared the altar for a weekday liturgy, young Clara, no more than 8, approached me quietly. "Father," she said, eyes wide, "will the white light come back?" I knelt to meet her gaze. "I don't know, Clara, but he is always here. Light or not." She nodded solemnly and returned to her pew. We spoke of it rarely, not because we doubted, but because it felt too sacred to name, like trying to hold light in your hands. It had lasted no more than 3 minutes, maybe 4, a sliver of time, but in those minutes, the veil between earth and heaven had grown thin, and we had seen through. The light had faded like morning mist, gentle and silent, but its memory remained. In our prayers, in our silence, in the way we now approached the Eucharist, not as a symbol, not as a routine, but as the trembling threshold of something vast and eternal. No signs had been given, no messages left behind, only light and presence, and the undeniable sense that, for a few sacred minutes, we had stood on holy ground. Even now, years later, I do not tell this story often, but when I do, I always begin the same way. No one took a photo, no one captured the light, because it wasn't meant to be captured. It was meant to be received, like grace, like faith, like Him. Chapter 4. Afterglow. It didn't take long for the whispers to begin. By Monday morning, the village square, the same cobbled, quiet circle where folks usually spoke of crops, weather, or whose goat had wandered off again, buzzed with something far more delicate. Not scandal, not gossip, something harder to name. Wonder. They didn't know how to say it, so they didn't. Instead, I heard fragments. Did you see? Was it real? Do you think? No. I mean, I was looking right at it. No one dared speak too loudly. It wasn't out of fear, but reverence, the way people lower their voices when passing a graveyard at dusk, or when a thunderstorm rolls in and the air thickens with something holy and unspoken. That entire week, I noticed the change. People were different, not dramatically so, but subtly. They walked slower, held eye contact longer. Their movements seemed less rushed, as if they were waiting for something to unfold. A second act, an explanation, or maybe another moment. But none came. As for me, I remained silent. I didn't write about it in the parish bulletin. I didn't mention it in my Sunday homily. I didn't bring it up at all. Not because I didn't believe, but because I wasn't sure what I believed. What had I seen? A light, yes, a glow, but also a presence. One that didn't demand belief, yet invited it. One that didn't say a word, but spoke to the deepest part of the soul. Still, I feared the weight of names, the risk of calling it miracle too quickly. How do you define something that slips through every net of language? A trick of the light. Some whispered, a reflection, perhaps, optical illusion. I didn't argue, nor did I confirm. I prayed instead, in the early mornings before lauds, and in the silence after compline. I would sit before the tabernacle and simply whisper, "Grant me wisdom, Lord," not answers, just wisdom. The first real conversation I had about it came from someone I hadn't expected. Sister Magdalena. She had been a part of the parish longer than I had, longer than most. In fact, at nearly 80, she moved slower than she used to, and her hearing wasn't what it once was. But her eyes remained sharp, and her faith, sharper still. She found me Tuesday morning, seated in the sacristy, preparing the linens for the midday mass. "Padre," she said without preamble, folding her hands over the edge of the wooden table. "I've seen many things in this life. Death, war, even what they call miracles. But I've never felt the room breathe the way it did on Friday." I didn't respond right away. She waited. Then she said it. It was him. I looked up. Her face was calm, assured. I wanted to ask, "How do you know?" But I didn't, because I knew too. Not from logic, not from theology, from the stillness, from the afterglow that still clung to every brick of that old church-like morning dew that refuses to lift. She smiled faintly. "Don't waste time trying to explain what's already been received. You don't teach a flower how to open. It just does." After that, I began to listen more. To the parishioners, to their confusion, their questions, their hesitations. Most didn't want explanations. They wanted permission to wonder, to believe, without being thought naive or foolish. Some asked, very gently, if the church would investigate. I smiled at that. What would they investigate? A moment, a silence, a flicker of light no one caught on film. No, this was not something to study. It was something to sit with. And so we did, in the days that followed. Adoration hours were fuller. People stayed longer. There were fewer whispered conversations about the weather and more about prayer. Even our choir rehearsals took on a new depth, less about pitch and more about presence. The hill seemed quieter, somehow, not empty, just hushed, as if the earth itself didn't want to interrupt. One evening, while locking the church, I found myself hesitating at the door. I turned, looked once more at the tabernacle, and whispered without meaning to, "You're still here." I wasn't expecting a response, but I felt it, a warmth, not heat, exactly, but something that settled over me like a blanket drawn up in the middle of the night. And I realized, the glow may have vanished, but the light remained. Not around us, within us, in every act of reverence, every quiet genuflection, every breath drawn in faith. That was the miracle, wasn't it? Not the glow itself, but the way it changed how we saw everything afterward, the way we now lingered in silence, the way children looked at the altar as if it might breathe, the way old men cried without shame, the way even skeptics came back, not for answers, but for peace. Yes, it was him, and he had not left. Chapter 5. Questions and Silence. It started with a phone call. A woman from a neighboring town, Neustadt, I think, asked if she and a small group might come to pray in our church. Her voice trembled slightly, as if she wasn't sure she should be asking. I told her she was welcome, of course. We were always open. The next day, they arrived. 5 people, middle-aged, earnest, with eyes that scanned the sanctuary as though expecting to see the veil between heaven and earth still cracked open. They knelt, they prayed, they left in silence. A few days later, another car arrived, then a van, then a tour bus. Not a large one, maybe a dozen seats, but still. I watched from my rectory window as people I'd never seen before stepped onto the frost-covered stone path leading up to the church. They moved slowly, reverently. Some had rosaries in their hands. One woman carried a small notebook, though she never wrote anything in it. Another simply stood outside the wooden doors, crying. The word had spread, not through newspapers or official channels, through whispers, through testimonies, through something older and more powerful than press. Wonder. By the end of that week, I began to recognize the pattern. They came not for spectacle, but for silence, not for proof, but for presence. Some stayed just a few minutes, making the sign of the cross before stepping back into the cold. Others remained for hours, unmoving, eyes fixed on the tabernacle. One woman came every day for 9 days straight. She said nothing. She never approached me, but she lit a candle each time and knelt in the same pew. I learned later that her son had left the church years ago. On the 9th day, he came with her. The villagers watched all of this with quiet amazement. Some offered soup and bread to the visitors. Others offered directions, or simply nodded as they passed. But none dismissed it, not anymore. Whatever doubts had lingered in the first days had softened into something else. Reverent curiosity. It was then that a small group approached me after Sunday Mass. They stood together, 10 or 11 of them, young and old, men and women, shifting nervously near the back pews. Their spokesperson, a wiry man named Gerhard, removed his cap and cleared his throat. "Padre," he said, "we've been talking and praying. We'd like to hold a novena to the Blessed Sacrament, 9 days, quiet, no announcements, just prayer." I nodded. There was nothing in canon law forbidding it, nothing controversial in their request, and everything in my heart said yes. So it began, each evening for 9 days. We gathered in the church. No music, no preaching, just exposed Eucharist and soft candlelight. I kept the monstrance simple, a small, antique piece passed down through 3 priests before me. But to those gathered, it might as well have been made of gold. The first night, 20 people came. The second, 40. By the 5th night, the church was full, and the silence, oh, the silence, it was deeper than before. Not empty, but saturated. It felt like being inside a held breath, as if the whole village had leaned forward together, waiting. On the 7th day of the novena, a man arrived late, dressed in a tailored wool coat, with thick spectacles and a leather satchel. He introduced himself afterward as Dr. Reinhardt, professor of theology at a university I'd heard of but never visited. "I've been hearing things," he said politely, "rumors, stories. I wanted to ask a few questions." Purely academic, I invited him for tea. We sat in the rectory's small study, surrounded by books and the faint scent of candle wax. He asked about the Friday liturgy. I answered what I could. He asked if anyone had taken a photograph. I shook my head. He asked how many witnesses. I told him I hadn't counted. He opened his notebook, made a few lines, then paused. "And you, Father Elias, do you believe it was miraculous?" I looked at the tea in my hands. "I believe it happened," I said. He smiled, a kind smile. "Fair enough." He stayed for the rest of the novena, always seated near the back, never speaking. After the 9th day, he left without a word. But he crossed himself before he did. It was inevitable, I suppose, that someone from the media would come. They arrived one morning, 2 men, a woman, and a cameraman, friendly enough, dressed in dark coats and boots. They knocked at the rectory door and introduced themselves. "Just a short interview," they said, "to help the public understand. People are curious. It's quite a story." I declined. They persisted. I declined again. They asked if they could film the sanctuary. I said no. The church is not a curiosity. The tabernacle is not content. They left, not unkindly, but clearly disappointed. That night, the church was full again. Candles flickered. Shadows danced along stone walls. The Eucharist remained still, radiant in its silence. And I remained still, too. I did not seek answers. I sought only to remain in that stillness, to protect it, to listen. Because not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be held. And in the silence that followed, I began to understand. The light had passed, but its echo had just begun. Chapter 6. The presence that remains. Some things are felt more than seen. That was the nature of what lingered in the days and weeks after the light. It wasn't a tangible radiance. No fire dancing atop the altar. No glow one could point to and say, "There it is." And yet, when you stepped through the old wooden doors of St. Otmar's, you knew he was still there. Not in the dramatic sense, not in signs or voices, but in the stillness, the kind that pressed softly against your skin, like mist curling through a forest at dawn. The kind of presence that needed no name. The tabernacle had become the silent heart of our church. People came not for answers anymore. They came to sit, to kneel, to breathe. Some came before work, their breath fogging in the morning chill. Others wandered in during lunch breaks, boots wet from melting snow. Still others came after dark, when the nave was lit only by a few candles and the red flicker of the sanctuary lamp. And the same words whispered again and again, "I don't know why I'm here. I just needed to be." That was enough. One afternoon, I sat at the back of the church, writing in my journal, when the door creaked open. A man in his early 30s stepped in, hesitated, then removed his cap. His coat was city-made, modern, clean-lined. He looked out of place, like someone who'd stumbled in by accident. But he hadn't. He walked the length of the center aisle slowly, hands in his pockets, eyes on the tabernacle. When he reached the front pew, he sat, not knelt, just sat. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I closed my journal. After a long time, he stood and turned. His eyes were wet. "I haven't been in a church in 10 years. He said quietly, "Not since my mother died." I didn't reply, just listened. "I don't even know why I came today. I was passing through. Something told me to stop." He wiped his face with his sleeve. "I don't know if I believe in God, but whatever that is." He gestured toward the sanctuary. "That is real." He left without another word. Later that week, a young couple arrived carrying a small child, no more than 4, bundled in layers of scarves and a knit cap. They looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, like people who had run out of places to go. They sat in the last pew. The father held the child on his lap. The mother stared straight ahead, unmoving. The child had a heart condition. I learned later, one of those congenital things with long names and short prognoses. They'd been traveling to a hospital in another region, heard of our church from a friend, and decided, without quite knowing why, to stop. The child fidgeted, then grew still. After a few minutes, he leaned into his father's chest and fell asleep. And then, without prompt or warning, he smiled in his sleep. Not a twitch, not a fluke, a full, soft, peaceful smile. The parents noticed. They looked at each other, and they cried. They stayed for over an hour, just sitting there, no requests, no questions, just presence. I've seen many things in my years as a priest, but I have never seen hearts soften the way they did during that season. Arguments settled without a word. Strangers embraced without explanation. People who hadn't spoken in years found themselves side by side in the same pew, neither willing to leave first. And in every instance, it wasn't what anyone said, it was what was felt. Peace. That strange, elusive thing that no doctrine can manufacture and no priest can summon. It simply descended, like dew. We didn't keep records. There were no guest books, no testimonies, no signed affidavits, just stories, whispers, moments. A woman who said her insomnia vanished after a night of prayer. A teenage boy who stopped coming to Mass but lingered one evening, then returned the next day with his grandmother. A farmer who dropped to his knees the moment he crossed the threshold, weeping for reasons he couldn't explain. Each encounter, tiny, but none of them forgotten. One night, I sat alone long after the last candle had burned low. Outside, the snow was falling again, soft, unhurried. I looked at the tabernacle and whispered, "You've changed us," not in loud ways, not in ways the world would notice, but in the most essential ways. We were no longer just a village with an old stone church. We had become, in some quiet sense, holy ground, not because of what had happened, but because of what remained, the presence and the peace that followed it everywhere. Chapter 7. A sacred reminder. 1 year later, the snow came early. It drifted across the hill in wide, slow flakes, resting on rooftops, clinging to tree limbs, wrapping the village of St. Otmar in a hush that reminded me of that day. The day something we couldn't name shimmered into the middle of our quiet lives and left us all slightly undone. A full year had passed. The world had moved on. Of course, most had forgotten, even among those who had once knelt in awe. Memory faded, as memories tend to do when tangled in the noise of everyday life. But not for me, and not for the ones who stayed. We were preparing again for Holy Week. Same liturgies, same readings, same long nights of silence and flickering candles. And yet, nothing was the same. There was something deeper in the way the choir rehearsed, in the way the children carried palms, in the way Sister Magdalena polished the brass on the thurible. The silence wasn't emptiness anymore. It was attention. It was presence. And so, on Good Friday, as I stood once again before the altar, preparing to preach, something I had not done the year before, I felt the weight of what needed to be said. Not as an explanation, but as a reminder. I looked out at the congregation, fuller than usual. Some familiar faces, some new, and I spoke from the place that had stayed tender in me all year long. He came quietly. I began. There was a rustle of stillness in the pews, not with thunder or lightning, not with proclamations or voices from the clouds. He came the way he always does, softly, gently, almost unnoticeably. A flicker, a breath. I let the silence settle again. Many of you were here, many of you saw, and many did not. But whether your eyes were open or closed, whether you saw with sight or with spirit, what happened was not a performance. It was not proof. It was presence. A few in the front row bowed their heads. We spend so much of our lives asking for signs, for God to shout, to split the heavens, to give us something we can point to and say, "See, there, that proves it." But the truth is, that's not how he comes. I looked toward the tabernacle. He comes in silence, in stillness, in bread, in wine, in the smallest gesture, in the aching hunger of a lonely heart, in a moment of inexplicable peace. And the only thing he ever asks in return is that we notice. After Mass, no one rushed to leave. They lingered in the pews, in the aisles, at the base of the altar, not to look for another miracle, but to remember. And somehow, that felt holier. In the days that followed, people returned quietly to their lives. But something remained different. The silence had taken root. It grew in small ways, in how neighbors greeted each other, in the way the children bowed before the Eucharist, in how long people lingered with their candles after lighting them. Faith had softened us and strengthened us, not because it had proven itself, but because it had drawn us into something beyond proving. I still sit in the sanctuary some nights long after the lights have dimmed. I listen for nothing in particular, but in the not hearing, I feel him more deeply than in any homily I've ever preached. And I remember, miracles don't have to flash. They don't need to be seen. They just need to be received, like dew, like grace, like breath. So if you ask me today what I believe, I will say this: I believe in the host that glowed. But even more than that, I believe in the presence that remains after the glow fades. I believe in the God who comes quietly, just as he always does. And I believe that to recognize him, all we truly need is a heart willing to notice. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1. Thank you for listening to today's story. If you found it meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us and catch more stories like this. I'll be back soon with more quiet mysteries and sacred moments to share. Take care and see you in the next episode.